Do you ever wonder how birthdays developed into what they are today? Did we always celebrate them the same way, or did they transform across centuries? You won't believe that blowing out candles is just a tiny part of the wild traditions that ruled our decades. So you'll be pretty surprised to know this, but the art of gift giving is actually pretty much a dying platform. I don't mean just going out to the store, handing in your money and buying something. No, I mean the entire 9 yards. The wrappings, the thoughtful little notes, the careful coordination, and all the little extra effort that went into giving a gift. It's like people always say, it really is the thought that counts. See, gift giving started dying out more and more towards the 2000s. You could call it a little bit of consumer culture just taking over. Now that you get pretty much everything ready-made, you could call it people losing their sense of sentimentality, but ultimately, people just don't get as many gifts as they used to. The trees around Christmas always look just a little bit lighter, and most of the stereotypes we grew up on, like that holiday season shopping spree, are now pretty much just things of the past. All cultures deal with gift giving differently, but at least in America, it was an integral part of the year. It was just common to expect that you'd take that shopping trip and get gifts for everyone. Not only was it something you were socially expected to do, it was a part of the social fabric of American society as a whole. I think the bonding was actually just the start of it, yet it was still the most important part. If you fast forward today, though, you'll just see a completely different landscape. I mean, here's the thing. It's not like people turned heartless over a century. Of course, we still want to smother our family, friends, and partners with as much financial favoritism as we can, but what if you're just hurting financially? See, that kind of tight spot is exactly the situation most Americans find themselves in these days. It's just getting harder to keep a roof over your head, with rising rent prices being one of the biggest reasons people have toned down gift giving. Forget getting a PlayStation 5 on your birthday. You'll probably be getting a new hoodie instead. There is still Black Friday, but let's be honest, that's an entire ordeal. In the 1900s, it was still a lot easier to engage in gift giving. It was cheaper, more affordable, and a lot more accessible. There was another side to the entire conversation that I don't think has anything to do with money, though. People have become a lot less connected and have lost their communal spirit, at least compared to the 1900s. It was even common for neighbors to exchange gifts with your neighbor, but would that kind of thing fly nowadays? Either way, I'd sure like to be back 100 years for any occasion, really. Especially since the tradition for the next decade isn't nearly as exciting as ripping open a package on your birthday, right? There's this whole suspense and vibe to it. Plus, a lot of these gifts were pretty thoughtful and planned out. People put that kind of time into personalizing something for a loved one back then. So, gift cards are what had the 1910s in a chokehold. Apparently, gift cards were a tradition that first formally started all the way back in 1843 with the advent of the first ever Christmas card. It was printed and made entirely by John Calcott Crosley for Sir Henry Cole, and those were the first ever 1,000 copies that were sold. By the 1860s, business was booming. Gift cards were something that became a commercial goldmine all over the United States. It even attracted a lot of foreign investment, you know? Germany wanted all their fingers in the gift card pie. In fact, one of the most popular manufacturers around the time, Hallmark in Kansas City, was a big part of the economy. Their cards were the first ones to ever be a little customized and different from the typical stuff you were used to. Naturally, people wanted to take part in the trend. It was seen as a cute and fun way to show someone you were thinking about them on their special day. It also just went fantastically with the gift itself, as I'm sure you're all very used to by now. After all, the gift card industry makes around $7.5 billion these days. Still, here, in the 1910s, it was really new. Gift cards also became some of the most accessible things you could ever get. They were there in stationery shops, grocery stores, gift shops, and just about every mom-and-pop joint. It was so common to get a gift card that a lot of people also started doing little discounts on them. Like, if you'd get this and get it wrapped up, then you'd get a gift card to go with it. Kinda came as a bundle, and I think it worked. Plus, it's always cute to see a gift card made, especially for you. People even got into making their own as an evolution of the trend, and I think the whole thing peaked there, really. So, the 1920s are pretty famous for one thing and one thing only. That would be the 1929 stock market crash and the financial apocalypse that it was for the world. What people don't commonly know about the entire decade is that before all of that, there was actually a bit of an economic boon, which meant that people were getting more groceries than ever, and with extra ingredients, people often came to the conclusion of throwing a party. It was really common for celebrations to include gifts and gift cards too, but it was only in this decade that those massive birthday gatherings became a real thing. People were getting together to throw a feast, and it wouldn't be good for just a birthday. Sure, it was one hell of a party, and it was a pretty good way of making someone feel special, but there were a lot more than just two birds killed with one stone here. It was an excuse for relatives who hadn't seen each other in forever to catch up with each other. It was a way for people to find new connections too, often trying to strike up a conversation at parties. Naturally, you wouldn't expect to find a best friend or the love of your life at your nephew's 8th birthday party, but people would throw celebrations even for the older adults too. So the drinks would flow, people would exchange all kinds of gifts and gossip, and they would party well into dawn. That was how people celebrated each other's birthdays all throughout the 1920s, but towards the market crash, that came to a stop, at least in the conventional sense. People were used to lavish parties that went all out, but after the crash, people were just getting together for two reasons. It was often possible to make a lot more food when people would pool together for dinner, even if there were more mouths to feed. Secondly, it was also a pretty cheap way to do something for someone's birthday. As the Depression went on and sunk its teeth even deeper, the nature of these get-togethers would change pretty drastically. Despite that, people would still remember each other's birthday, always waiting for the date when they would party it up as much as they could, even if the partying meant fish chowder and potato soup more than steaks and birthday cake. In the 1930s, people were really into having birthdays with specific themes. Some of the most precious memories came as a result of a character-themed birthday party. You know, though, it wasn't even the most popular thing to come out of comic books. Apparently, the entire medium was getting a lot more attention. There were niche characters who were slowly taking over children across the country, and merchandising was more of a thing than it ever was. In that kind of era, it just became a lot easier to simply throw a big gathering with food like people had already been doing and just ask people to dress up according to the theme. It was mostly a thing in the suburbs, though, interestingly enough. Despite all the merchandise and items available for even die-hard fans who would throw a birthday party themed after your show, it wasn't always affordable. That meant that not everyone would have the same access to all of these things and get to throw these kinds of events. Even today, that is kind of true. There's a financial barrier to cosplaying as a hobby, for example. To be fair, though, a lot of the characters that were popular by now weren't really that complicated. Stuff like Buck Rogers, Popeye, and Shirley Temple was easy enough that you could make their outfits at home too and still get away with it. Which really meant that with just a bit of creativity and resourcefulness, it was a lot easier to just make your own costumes. Today, we have to do elaborate Iron Man suits. But back then, Popeye was just a guy in a black tee and sailor pants. Well, that and a lot of spinach. The 1940s were maybe the most awkward times to have a birthday. Back then, people weren't even really celebrating, so they were known as wartime birthdays. I'm sure you can already imagine why, or actually, maybe you can't. Wars happen today, and people still get to go on with their daily lives, pretty much undisturbed even. Still, back in the 1940s, the effects of the World War weren't so easy to ignore. Families were always facing really bad food shortages, and they were just barely making ends meet. There was also just no festive spirit left in anyone. They had just gone through the Depression, which, to be fair, really put the American population through the ringer. On top of that, they then had to deal with the Second World War, a conflict that was arguably even worse than the first one. I wouldn't exactly be jumping for joy in a time like that either. Also, it was just really hard to even get cake during those times. There was a big rationing policy going on, and one of the hardest-hit items was usually eggs, which meant that it became pretty hard for people to get what they needed to bake a cake at home. People were also just struggling with using appliances in general thanks to the inflation around, well, everything. As alternatives, things that people used dearly in the Depression, like milkless, eggless, and butterless cake, or depression cake, really came in handy. They weren't the same as a baked one with frosting and a cute little design, but in a time like this, It really was the thought that made all the difference in the world. Plus, people tried to do what they could with icing, even if they couldn't go for the ones in the store. All the trends that were popular in the past decades were still around too. People couldn't buy gifts, cards, and afford fancy, elaborate party menus or character suits, but they could sew a sweater or scarf, write a letter, and make what they could. Maybe they'd use a bit more eggs and meat that day, or maybe they'd spend money getting good food. Either way, despite the circumstances, people still tried to celebrate in whatever way they could, even if being on the same scale as before would take a lot of time. So the entire history of the Happy Birthday song is actually pretty interesting. Haven't you ever wondered where this universal tune ever comes from? I know I have. After all, seriously, how does everyone know it? Apparently, the original tune was actually something different altogether. This one was known as Good Morning to You, and its lyrics went something like, "Good morning to you, good morning to you, good morning, dear children, good morning to all." And yeah, I sang it in the Happy Birthday tune too. This was a song that was made by Patty and Mildred Hill, who were American sisters working with kids. Patty was a principal for kindergartners, and Mildred was a pianist who composed her own music. The next stop for the two was obvious, really, and their tune really caught on. Now, the lyrics changed to the ones we're familiar with somewhere along the 1910s, but it wasn't until 1924 when Robert H. Kuhlman included the Happy Birthday song in his songbook, alongside the same Good Morning melody, that it became a tight-knit association in people's heads. By that point onwards, it just became pretty common to sing this whenever there was a celebration. Then it became even more of a mainstream phenomenon when it got a lot of time on radio broadcasts and popular media. The musical in 1931, Bombo, for example, was one of the first films to ever include the song. Then, around 1935, there was actually a decent amount of legal fighting over the copyright of the song. I mean, people can't miss a gold mine, right? The Summy Company claimed to file for a copyright claim on behalf of both of the sisters, but their case wasn't exactly the strongest. It wasn't sure that they were the ones who wrote the lyrics to the birthday song after all. Eventually, in the end, someone did get the copyright, and that ended up being Warner or Chappell Music. They then got the usual payout off of royalties and other commercialized uses of the tune, but this helped to cement it as a birthday tune that people wouldn't ever forget. It even grew past just being a thing in America and became a birthday tradition all over the world. It's still one that's arguably even more popular today than it used to be all the way back then. And now, the song is public domain in America too. I know we're all a little tired of hearing it sometimes, but can you imagine living in a world where you wouldn't hear this? That sounds just a little bit more dull. Across the 1960s, though, pop culture really started taking off. It wasn't just movies and songs. There was stardom like never before. There was all kinds of new music, art styles that hadn't been there before, experimental kinds of film, new cultural movements and trends, and a style specific to the 60s and 70s that made this a decade known for its lasting impact on pop culture. Naturally, the celebrations that would go on in the family had to reflect that. Musically speaking, there was a massive influx of British and European music. The Beatles were just about cementing themselves as one of the biggest acts of the century and gaining notoriety worldwide, and America wasn't any different. Almost every birthday party during this decade had a Beatles album playing, and that wasn't all. There were bands like the Rolling Stones, who really pioneered a lot of British rock and brought it over to America, making it a far more respected aspect of music than it used to be. Then you had soul artists like Aretha Franklin and Marvin Gaye, and folk ones like Bob Dylan, who were raising a lot of points that could be considered counterculture in their lyrics. Basically, there was something for everyone, so no matter what kind of party you enjoyed, I guarantee there was some kind of space in the 1960s that had it. Pop culture birthday parties were just what everyone was doing. You also had new films like Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate, and access to Italian and French cinema like never before. All of these new options really influenced how pop culture worked in the 1960s, and it was a big part of the themes of the parties too. You could have a birthday party themed after your favorite musical, or you could completely go the classic rock route. Also, all of this meant that all the previous things people had picked up along the decades, like gift-giving and character-themed parties, also expanded their horizons a lot more. By that, I mean you could always give someone merchandise from their favorite movie, or take them to see their favorite rock concert or pop artist, or get them an album they've always wanted. You could do a Beatles-themed birthday party, and believe it or not, a lot of people really did do that. So by now, you can probably see some semblance of the many parts of a typical birthday party of the modern era coming together. All the things we do today had their roots in these decades, but it wasn't until the 1970s that it really started looking like what we're used to. Giving goodie bags, for example, didn't really start as a tradition until the 70s, even though it was already a practice. There was a general makeover in how birthdays were perceived culturally, and there was a massive change in how people's shopping worked throughout the decade. To put it simply, people never had that much choice in their lives, at least as far as consumer variety went. The truth is, mass production had by then become a thing like never before. People had so much more to buy thanks to the rise of chain stores and mass-produced toys, candy, and other products aimed specifically at parties. By the 1920s even, sure, people had a concept of birthday celebrations, but it mostly extended to making space in the budget for a lot of food. By the 70s, however, the food was the least of your worries. You had to focus on the decor, the birthday props, the theme, the cake, the gifts, and sometimes even the guest list. At least, if we start talking about the more influential and well-off families. It was really from the upper class where the idea of goofy bags started too. In the 70s, it had become common practice for people who were from well-off families to send off their guests at the end of a party with some small treats and gifts to thank them for coming. People adopting what the rich do isn't exactly anything new, so you can imagine how the habit spread far enough in the country that everyone started doing it. It just became another part of the party routine and another expense to add to the list. Like I said though, party culture had itself changed. There were now even party supply companies that were giving out pre-packaged goodie bags. A lot of these were themed after specific characters in shows like Mickey Mouse, and they were almost always aimed at toddlers, kindergartners, and little children. That's how these companies put every parent in a position where they couldn't say no, because, well, if your friends had goodie bags at theirs, you gotta have it at yours, right? That's how an entire generation grew up with the concept of giving goodie bags at the end of a party, and I think it's a pretty sweet tradition. Have you ever done this? Or do you think it's okay to just let it be? By the 1980s, birthday parties had pretty much turned into what we know them to be like today. If you thought I made it seem like consumerism rose during the 70s, you have no idea what you're in for with the 80s. It felt like all the frugality and cost-effectiveness that Americans had grudgingly learned in the past few decades all went out the window in some nationwide catharsis. People were spending money like never before, and the baby boom had not helped at all. A lot of kids were being born, and a lot of new birthday parties were being added to the calendar. Then, there was this shift in mentality too. Instead of just spending a bit more trying to return to your pre-war and recession lifestyle, people went to the opposite end of the spectrum. Suddenly, more was better. A lot better. Themed parties had already become a big thing, but now, people were trying to get the biggest and most elaborate venues they could, especially for adult birthday parties. Yacht culture also kind of began in the really affluent neighborhoods, where people would start to throw birthday parties on yachts. Even middle-class families that were a little well-off really started to add to the activities you could expect in a birthday party. Things like magicians, entertainment performers, and bouncy houses were now being included as regular bars to meet for a good birthday. Cakes also really took off, as there was this big focus on baking, especially flashy baking with really stellar presentation, which dominated the 80s. It meant that not only was there a lot of expectation for the cake itself, but there was also a lot of competition. Honestly, I think that helped. People wanted to make the best cake out of everyone else, and it helped to let that motivate you. Actually, that competitive mindset didn't just cover the home chefs. It also meant that guest lists were growing bigger. There was, for the first time, a growing tradition of inviting not just your close friends and family to these parties, but also your work friends, neighborhood, and classrooms. All of that seems pretty well and good. I mean, the more the merrier, right? Unfortunately, it also meant that people were really competing with each other, especially the parents. They all wanted to be known for throwing the biggest, most memorable birthday party out of everyone else. And somewhere along the line, it stopped being completely about the kids. It kind of led to this cycle of each family, especially upper middle class ones, for whom birthday parties had become a status symbol, trying to outdo the other. Now, that meant that kids got parties like they had never experienced before. But a lot of these kids were also beginning to ache for more low-key, personalized, and intimate celebrations too. Not everyone wants to have a massive guest list with hired entertainment and 36 people they only kind of know. Sometimes, just your best friends and family are more than enough. Since America is such a big hub for consumerism, even compared to the rest of the world, every time something happens to cause a national change in how that works, birthday parties start looking a bit different too. What I'm referring to is the growing trend of people throwing birthday parties at fast food chains and ordering fast food to fill up the menus of their homemade parties. The thing is, by the 90s, convenience culture had set in deeply into the daily routines of the American people. What this basically meant was that everyone was used to easy eating, and they weren't really down with the amount of effort people were usually used to putting into birthday parties. I guess you could probably call this the first sign of that loss of personalization we talked about all the way at the start of the video. Now the population had naturally become just a tad bit lazier, so how was that void going to be filled up? Well, fast food chains were the perfect thing. They weren't just good for food, they had it all. They would also double as venues since they offered birthday entertainment like performers and playgrounds and treated you specially if it was your birthday too. Anything from playing the happy birthday song to a free meal or a goodie bag was on the table, so there was always that incentive too. McDonald's even took it a step further and offered free Happy Meals to every kid that was attending as a guest. Plus, again, throwing parties at fast food chains became another kind of status symbol among some tax brackets. People thought that it was a sign of spoiling your kids on one hand, and the other thought that it was a cute way of giving kids a chance to party it up at their favorite restaurant. People were throwing out previous party staples like sliders and sloppy joes in favor of burgers, chicken nuggets, and milkshakes. McDonald's, for one, was one of the biggest places to go when you needed party food. Other fast food chains, which specialized in bulk food like Pizza Hut, often had deals and bundles targeted specifically at families looking for a large feast. They even had party packs, and it was basically just a really convenient affair. All you had to do was pay, and you were good to go. On the other hand, if you needed a specific kind of cake, you could always go to the many new available options for that too. One of the most popular places was Dairy Queen, and they became known for pushing ice cream cakes as the new thing. There was pretty much just one thing missing, and that was video footage. Camcorder culture and video tributes became a thing that started with the 2000s. By the 80s and 90s, camcorders in general had become a lot more affordable than they used to be, and brands like Sony were already dominating the market and coming up with new and innovative models that fit the everyday needs of the family. Video cassette recorders were also perfect for households, and most families prioritized having one. You could record basic family memories and events, important milestones, and other things you just wanted to remember thanks to them. Parents especially started to document all kinds of things specifically so that they could end up making these video tributes around the time of their kid's 16th or 18th birthday. A lot of people even got to polish their skills with videography, thanks to it. Birthday video tributes pretty much were all homemade efforts after all. Some people really took it further and even started doing voiceovers, really taking it a step farther. Then, you had those janky PowerPoint edits with all kinds of popular music playing. You know exactly the ones I'm talking about. Still, no matter the quality, people had fallen in love with the idea of capturing live memories and moments, cherishing them for later. Plus, it wasn't just for kids. People would also hold these tributes for all kinds of family members. Even your grandpa would get a tribute, and it was pretty cute, to be honest. By the 90s, it became pretty much a norm for families to own some kind of camcorder, and by the 1990s, basic editing software like iMovie and Pinnacle Studio were also things that every 20-something was playing around with. Schools even used this development to push media skills as part of the curriculum, often giving students video assignments. Plus, shows on TV would also make a thing out of hosting competitions for edits and video tributes like these, with the best one winning some kind of prize. It basically meant that there was a big push overall throughout the culture of America to really take advantage of filming and camcorders. People weren't slow. They definitely jumped on the bandwagon as fast as they could. By the 2000s, video cassette recorders were also getting replaced by DVDs, and towards the 2010s, social media had taken off as a global phenomenon too. That meant that all this video compilation and footage that people were sitting on finally had a digital platform where people could share it. Camcorder footage, VHS tapes, and low-res video tributes are big defining parts of the aesthetic of the early 2000s, and are a big nostalgia moment for a lot of people who grew up with them. Birthday parties took a turn for the electronic later on, especially around the 2010s. See, people were discovering that they had a massive urge for all things electronic music. Electronic dance music or dance parties and red tie events more or less became the norm, especially if you were trying to do a 16th or 18th birthday. The national club and rave scene had pretty much turned into a must-have experience. People would go to high school or college, and a big part of dorm life was just being able to do all this. Club nights, rave scenes, and underground warehouse parties were pretty much how people functioned and had fun. Not only was it this universal party experience, but it was also how people socialized in this time. Now, the electronic dance music scene had always been a pretty big part of American culture throughout the later end of the 20th century too, but it never exploded into the mainstream like it did until the 2010s. Another standout feature of birthday celebrations in the 2010s was the rise of social media. Platforms like Instagram and Snapchat turned parties into highly curated events. Themed photo booths, hashtag trends, and stories capturing every moment made birthdays as much about the digital experience as the physical one. Custom playlists on streaming apps and live DJ sets often streamed online, ensuring the vibe of the celebration could reach even those who couldn't attend. There was also this massive culture around fashion associated with parties and partygoers. Glow sticks, flamboyant, flashy outfits, and fashion statements were all day-to-day facts of the nightlife in America. Naturally, birthdays were even more of a thrill. Ever remember those electronic dance music or house remixes of the Happy Birthday song? Well, most raves had their own dedicated set lists, but this was the most different that birthday parties had ever looked like. So, the weirdest birthday parties ever looked like was probably the 2020 and onwards COVID Zoom parties we'd have. They kind of seem like the culmination of everything we've been talking about, and they also represent a full 360 from where we started in the 1900s. Back then, there was a growing focus on people coming together, exchanging different gifts, and it was a bit more about the celebration of someone's special day. There was still a lot of fashion, music, and competition between people who would host and monitor alike, but that never felt like much of a priority. On the other hand, with the 2020s, though not really by their own choice since the masses were dealing with a severe global pandemic, people became pretty separated. Thanks to the quarantine efforts and the massive focus on social distancing, large-scale events with big guest lists basically became non-existent. Also, think about it for a second. Underground raves involve the entire venue being packed to the absolute brim until there's barely any space for people to move around anymore. Extravagant home parties are also a massive health hazard, since we all still vividly remember how easily COVID could spread. Most birthday parties were a lot easier to host over Zoom as a result. People got together, dressed up, and did most things they'd usually do for a party. Do you think it made people a bit more appreciative of some quality time spent with their loved ones? If you did celebrate your birthday like this, how was it for you? And if you have any other birthday stories from any of the decades on here, share those too. That wraps up the birthday traditions over the decades. Which tradition stood out to you? Comment down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.